QSO Today, episode 224, Phil Sittner, KD6RM. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for every level of amateur radio operator, and by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX single-band transceiver kit and now a new 10-watt all-band HF linear amplifier for the ham radio builder. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. Last week in episode 223, I made an important public service announcement as part of Denny Berg's WB9MSM's ham radio story. The context, in case you have not yet listened to Denny's story, is that while Denny was in good health, with no history of heart disease, a non-routine CT scan at the urging of his wife revealed blockages in arteries to his heart that would have made Denny's ex-wife a widow. Denny is recovering nicely, and after 5 stents were installed around his heart. I asked Dr. Scott Wright, K0MD, to chime in, and he sent me an article that he wrote for the National Contest Journal in 2009. I put a link into it in Denny's show notes page. Folks, and I'm speaking to my listeners over 50, we're all over the hill, and the slope is slippery if we do not take good care of our health. And I'm speaking generally. I love to sit at my ham radio desk and workbench for hours. However, Scott reminds us that we need to get up regularly and take a walk around the block. I have 2 dogs that come into my office almost on the hour to tear me away from my project for just a few minutes. In addition to eating right and visiting our doctor now and then, we need to keep moving to prevent having the ex-wife or our significant other from prematurely selling off our ham radio rigs and test equipment for pennies on the dollar. Put this podcast and your other favorites in your smartphone and take a walk. Take the stairs. Park the car a few blocks away from work and walk in. All of this activity, any of this activity, will save your life. That's the end of my health lecture. Phil Sittner, KD6RM, is active in his ham radio club in the Sacramento Valley, California. Phil grew up in Northern California and has pursued an active ham radio career that includes building radios and test equipment, designing antennas, and operating HF and rag chewing. As a resident of an HOA property, Phil shares some of his interesting antenna designs in this QSO today. KD6RM, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Phil?
I'm here.
Phil, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
I was about 10 years old, and there was a fellow who used to come by and fix our TV set. He's discovered that I had a real interest in electronics, so he used to allow me to come down to his shop on Saturday mornings, and he spent some time teaching me the fundamentals of electronics. And during that period, he suggested I get a ham radio license. So I put together a buzzer and a key and spent some time reading the ARRL license manual, got my code speed to 5 words a minute. And in those days, you could do a test through the mail. They didn't have the VE program. So my novice license was given through the mail by this friend of mine who was K6WG. His name was Keith Machin. And I was first licensed in 1959 at the age of 11.
And what was your novice call sign?
I was WN6UJN. And then when I upgraded with a conditional license, it became WA6UJN.
And why did you go for the conditional license? Were you far away from the field office?
Yes. I lived in Redding, and of course the closest field office was San Francisco, which was close to 300 miles away. I think in those days the limit was anything outside of 150 miles. You could do both the novice, I think even the tech, and the conditional by mail.
Now, Redding is out in the sticks. As I recall, it's in the northeastern corner of California, isn't that right?
It's dead center, quite north. It's at the top end of the Sacramento Valley.
Do you remember your first rig?
I do. This same fellow, K6WG, lent me an old Harvey Wells TS50B. That ought to raise some eyebrows. And at the time, my dentist was also a ham, and he lent me a Hallicrafter's S20R. So my first rig was a borrowed rig, and then I went on and built a transmitter. I'm trying to remember the tube complement. I think it was a 6AQ5 crystal oscillator that drove a 6146B. And that's what I used for the next few years.
In Reading, did you have an amateur radio club as a kid that you went to?
Late in that period, there was a club that sprung up in Reading. It wasn't very active, and it met up by the airport, Benton Field Airport, and it met in this old military Quonset hut. But I don't think there were 7 or 8 people that attended those meetings. I think it pretty much failed.
This was also a time of Sputnik, I think, emphasis on science and engineering and math in schools. Were you a part of that?
I was always fascinated by electronics and how things worked. And this same Elmer I was mentioning to you, he was a brilliant man. He taught me about, of course, we went through Ohm's law and Kirchhoff's laws and those kinds of things. But he also introduced me to Dr. Land's color theory, where you can build all colors. In Dr. Land's case, he used a binary system, red and green, with a couple of filters, and you were able to regenerate the entire color spectrum. And I believe that's how that whole Polaroid Land camera thing came to be. And he also introduced me to atomic structures, the Bohr atom and that kind of thing. And he actually built a mass spectrograph for assay purposes. One of his friends had opened up this mine and he wanted to assay the ore. So you'd take and drop these samples into this carbon arc lamp and then read out where the gaps in the spectrum were. Pretty impressive stuff for a kid of 11, 12 years old.
Sounds great. And, of course, there were a lot of mines up there, right, in the Reading area? There
were quite a few.
Did ham radio play a part, then, in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Initially I had thought I'd like to become an electronic engineer, but, in those days, we were not a well-to-do family as such. My father died when I was just a little guy. My mother raised the 3 of us, so there wasn't much in the way of assets. I couldn't see a way to fund a college education. So once I got out of school, of course, I went to work, and that was during the Vietnam era. I ended up eventually getting drafted, spent my year in Vietnam, came home, and then went back into the electrical supply business is actually what I did for my entire career. Ended up becoming a shareholder in a regional chain of electrical wholesalers. And, I actually led a pretty good life, made a pretty decent living at it, but I never did pursue that formal electronics education. So I've been a backyard tinkerer for a lot of years.
Ended up becoming an entrepreneur then?
Yes.
Do you mind saying what the company was?
At the time, it was a company called NorCal Electric Supply, which later was acquired by Rexal, which is a European concern. And I had sold my interest in the NorCal thing just a couple of years before the acquisition. And I went to work for a competitor, and I spent the last 21 years of my career working for the competitor. It was a good career.
And where's the home QTH now?
I live in a suburb of Sacramento, a place called Fair Oaks, California.
That's a relatively new community?
No, it's been around quite a while. I imagine Fair Oaks is, it's got to be 90, 100 years old. In fact, a social group I'm involved in is having a guest speaker this coming Wednesday. Local historian is going to talk about the evolution of Fair Oaks, and it's pretty much an agricultural kind of thing. A lot of citrus groves and that kind of thing were in this area. Of course, now it's primarily a suburb, housing, that kind of thing. But I'll know a lot more about it after Wednesday's meeting.
Well, the reason I asked the question is I've been out of California now for maybe 35 years, and there are cities now, at least in Southern California, that I'd never heard of that had been created since then and became part of the L.A. Southern California suburbs. So I thought maybe the same thing had happened up in Northern California.
Well, I think most of them around here have been around a long time, but they've all grown almost exponentially. A number of them have become incorporated in the Sacramento. It's a big chunk of California real estate anymore.
What's your current rig in Fair Oaks?
I have a Elecraft K3S, and I don't work a lot of HF. I do a little, and primarily it's CW. I find CW to be kind of an interesting way to make contacts. They seem to be friendlier QSOs. Is
this love of CW something that you've always had, or is it something that you've acquired along the way?
Well, I mentioned earlier that, the novice ticket was the 5-word per minute thing. And so I've been around Morse code for years, but recently I joined a second club in Sacramento, W6SM. The SFM stands for Samuel F. Morse. And it's a CW-only club with some dynamic enthusiasts. And so it's kind of fun to work with those guys and resurrect the old mode, and it's, I guess, nostalgia.
Do you like to rag chew on CW, or do you contest or do soda or anything like that?
Just rag chew. I'm thinking soda would be a very interesting thing to do, but I haven't tried that yet. It's on my list of to-dos.
Because you're surrounded by mountain peaks, it seems to me.
Right. The Sacramento Valley is west of the Sierra Mountains, and there's some gorgeous places up there to try. And as I mentioned, they're on my list of things to do.
Do you operate VHF, UHF, DMR, or anything like that?
A little bit of VHF and a little bit of UHF, local club repeaters. More of a social thing than anything else. I'm not real active with the repeater systems.
From what I could tell, you're a popular speaker at ham radio meetings. And one of the subjects you seem to speak a lot about is antenna fundamentals. What do you think are the fundamentals about antennas that many ham radio operators don't understand?
The interesting thing about antennas, Eric, is, you can buy a $200 rig or you can buy a $10,000 rig. And the real thing that limits your performance has little to do with the rig. It's your antenna. And it's also the most misunderstood topic. And it's also the one that you really need to spend some time on if you wish to have any kind of success with amateur radio. So most ham radio operators think that antennas are all about SWR. And while it's a valid point, when amateur radio was in its heyday earlier, there was very little mention of SWR because in those days, every rig had a built-in matching network. We called it the Pi network in the output section of the transmitter. So you just adjusted your transmitter until the output circuit was happy and went about your life. The real key to antennas is to pick the proper pattern so that your signal gets where you'd like to see it. And that's a much more difficult task. And, in the early days, there wasn't an awful lot of attention given to that. People had access to some height so they could get their antennas up height, which is kind of a key component of patterns. Nowadays, with these HOA associations, it's pretty tough to get some height without running into conflicts with the neighbors. So antenna patterns is a point that I touch on quite often. Explain why SWR is meaningful to your transmitter's output circuitry, but it doesn't really have much to do with how well the antenna performs. And then I also touch on the topic of resonance, how that applies, and hopefully explain to them that there are methods of compensating for these deficiencies. As you mentioned earlier, if you're able to get an antenna with a little bit of height and use an antenna tuner, it makes for a pretty universal tool.
I said to you earlier that at the Pacificon conference, the Friday before the conference actually starts, there's an all-day antenna conference. And it was very interesting, and all of the speakers who spoke had their interest in terms of the antennas they liked and the kinds of ways that antennas work. But there was a panel discussion at the very end, and it seemed to me that 4 out of the 5 panel members, when they were asked what would be their ideal antenna, all of them seemed to think a dipole high in the air with a balanced feed line and an antenna tuner at the bottom was their first choice for a multiband antenna. What do you think about that?
If you go back into the old amateur literature, handbooks dating back to the 20s and 30s and 40s, pictures of ham radio stations, you'll often see that the ham had a high dipole fed with open wire balanced feed line to their transmitter. And of course, the transmitter had either link coupling or a big pi network and one antenna, all bands. And it was late in the evolution that you actually started to see things like, the parasitic beams and that kind of thing. So while they liked the idea, that idea has been popular for a very, very long time.
But I guess the problem we have now is that the solid-state amplifiers that we all have on our new rigs don't like anything but a 50-ohm load. Perhaps that's the reason that antenna tuners are so popular, or do you think that people are trying to match poor antennas with antenna tuners in order to make those antennas compatible with their rigs?
Well, first of all, it's essential that you feed your transmitter with a 50-ohm load, which is kind of what really got the antenna tuner going. And the fact that you have a tuner allows you to use that same antenna on multiple bands. The challenge is efficiency, and the use of a tuner to arrive at a matching situation causes an awful lot of power in many instances to get trapped inside of that tuner.
Now, you spoke about homeowners association challenges for amateur radio operators who want to put up antennas. Well, what do you suggest for someone that's living in a California homeowners association size lot? All the trees were mowed down when they built the subdivision, and so now there's a bunch of new trees, and the roof is pretty stark and barren and out there for everyone to see. What do you suggest normally?
I happen to be one of those hams that lives in a heavily restricted HOA situation. And this HOA that we're in is very well managed. A professional property management firm runs it. As a consequence, they're very enforcement oriented. A number of HOAs, after a short period, they sort of die away. People get tired of being involved in them. There's some political concern. So even though there may be an HOA per se where you live, in some instances, they're not active. But in my case, I wanted to be able to operate the HF bands. And of course, most difficult, aside from 160 is 80 meters. You need 130 feet of space to put up a wire antenna. And so my initial attempt at this is I actually built an Eve-mounted dipole. And what I ran into with that antenna is with all these switch mode power supplies around, when you wrap that antenna around your house, it's very good at picking up all that noise. So I came up with a novel idea for an antenna as far away from the house as practical, and that is a fence-mounted 80-meter J-pole. And I know when people hear that, they're going to think that sounds nuts. And it is, but it works surprisingly well.
It's horizontal.
A horizontal fence-mounted 80-meter J-pole.
Well, that's a pretty incredible idea. And what did you make that out of, like 450-ohm twin lead or something like that?
No, it's fed with coax. And, in the old days, a J-pole is actually an end-fed ZEP antenna. And the term ZEP comes from the old Zeppelin airships. When those things were flying, communication to airships was done on HF frequencies, low HF frequencies. So they had to trail that antenna behind the airship. And of course, when you tried to feed an antenna on the end, you have to feed it at the high impedance point. And so the J-pole actually is a half-wave radiator with a quarter-wave matching section. So in my case, I built a quarter-wave matching section out of some 450-ohm air insulated line, just using little plastic pipe spacers. And then I tapped very close to the end my 50-ohm feed line to it. And at the end of the quarter wave section, of course, is the half-wave radiator. So if you were to look at this antenna, it looks just like a J-pole antenna that's so popular for 2 meters, but laid horizontally. In fact, in my case, it's in a U shape because you need about 200 feet of fence line to construct one of them.
So you're running the antenna around the back fence in a U shape?
Yes, sir. Wow.
Well, that's pretty clever. And its distance above the ground, well, it's not a dipole, right? So how does it perform? Because you had mentioned earlier about takeoff angle and.
Well, all antennas are a compromise, right. And this one is a major compromise. It's a classic NVIS antenna. The radiation angle is straight up. It's 90 degrees. I modeled it in easy NEC just to take a look, and it's exactly 90 degrees. It's straight up. And it's probably not terribly efficient, but it's much more efficient than no antenna.
And now this message from ICOM America. As we get past the contest season and into the holidays, it's now time to put an ICOM radio on your holiday wish list. So over the next few weeks, I will go into a deeper dive on the ICOM rigs that you should consider. Normally, when we speak of ICOM and its line of ham radio products, we normally speak about ham radio transceivers. However, did you know that ICOM America has a full line of radio equipment for aviation, land mobile, marine, and general coverage receivers for listening? So this week, I want to talk about the ICOM ICR30 dual band and reel recording receiver. This is a holiday gift for anyone who is interested in listening to radio signals between DC and blue light. All kidding aside, this ICOM ICR30 covers from 100 kHz to 3.3 GHz. You can easily listen to your favorite 80-meter nighttime net, while at the same time listening to your local police, fire, and rescue channels. This is a scanner on steroids that allows you to listen to analog single sideband, AM, FM, CW, and wideband FM. The ICR30 also decodes P25, NXDN, and D-Star. In addition, you can monitor your local repeaters using CTCSS and DTCSS. Users of the ICR30 can monitor HF and UHF signals simultaneously and can scan for other channels on the B channel side while receiving the main signal on the A channel band. Using the dual watch mode, this portable receiver can individually record the audio of the two bands received onto a micro SD card in WAV format. A built-in GPS receiver displays your current location and can be used to locate stations within 100 miles providing that you program the station's position in advance. Connect your wireless headset with Bluetooth. And finally, there's both Android and iOS apps available that work with the ICOM ICR30. So if you're looking to have the most state-of-the-art and feature-loaded stocking stuffer for your first adopter relative, then check out the ICOM ICR30 at your ham radio dealer near you, or go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur to find out more about this amazing portable DC to daylight scanning receiver. And when you finally make that holiday purchase, tell the dealer that you heard about the ICOM ICR30 here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Now, do you operate other bands with that antenna?
No. That's strictly for 80 meters. For 40, I have a pair of phased verticals. They're a quarter wavelength apart, and I use elevated radials. N6BT Tom Schiller, who was at that Pacificon antenna session, you may recall him.
Yeah.
He's a big proponent of elevated radials, and in my case, they work quite well. These two verticals that are also fence mounted are only visible from the back of the house, so the neighbors don't complain. At least the back neighbor is pretty friendly, so I got away with that one. The takeoff angle on these phased verticals is about 25 degrees, which is not too bad. And it's a pretty effective antenna. I've got it oriented due east.
Now, are these a quarter wavelength long? I mean, are they over 30 feet long?
Actually, these antenna elements are 20 feet tall, and I mounted them in a piece of 1.25 PVC pipe that's strapped to the corresponding fence posts. So they extend 20 feet above the fence line, and there's a small top hat on each of them. And then there's a piece of conductor that I strapped to the outside of the PVC to the matching network. So electrical length is a little short. Electrically, they're about 25, 28 feet long. So it requires a little bit of inductance to match them to the resonant frequency.
Oh, and then your radials are running around the fence, or they come out into the yard?
They're attached to the fence as well. With elevated radials, you have to be careful. You know, they're actually the ends of the radial are also a high impedance point, so there's high voltage present on those radials. So you have to insulate them from the fence as well.
They're high enough that you walk under them in the yard?
No. They're attached to the fence. They follow the fence line. So they're out of the way and inconspicuous and pretty effective.
And you don't have like a ball or an eagle on top of each one and fly a flag up every once in a while?
No, it's just the top hat is actually 4 spokes of 1/8-inch brass brazing rod, and the birds love them. There's lots of birds that sit on my antenna.
So the fact that you like 80 meter rag chewing at night then on CW, and or 40 meter DX also maybe in the evening. Do you operate any of the higher frequency bands?
No, I did put up an attic mounted 20 meter 2-element wire beam very recently. I haven't had a chance to really play with it yet, but I think that might work fairly well. This is a single-story house, so the peak of my roof is about 16 feet, and so it's a linear loaded 2-element Yagi attic mounted that I put together, and I haven't had a chance to really evaluate it yet.
One of the articles that I found online about you said that you're a home brewer, and every once in a while you take your home brew devices out and you show them off. Are you a home brewer? And what do you home brew?
I do an awful lot of home brew stuff. I even do a lot of surface mount. In some instances, I actually breadboard on copper clad and lay things out with a machinist caliper and then carve the traces with an X-Acto knife. That's kind of pushing home brew to the limit.
Well, I'll say
I do an awful lot of printed circuit board layout stuff. I've built 2 spectrum analyzers, several RF power meters, several antenna analyzers, a couple dual conversion receivers. There must be a dozen or so QRP transmitters that I've built. What else? Lots of stuff.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into this just for a second. You say you like working on printed circuit board, and do you use a printed circuit board layout software? What do you like?
I use EagleCAD. I got started with it many years ago. It was about the only thing really available. Of course, that world has changed dramatically. But I'm pretty comfortable with Eagle, and most of my stuff is just 2-layer boards, fairly small stuff, so it's effective. I actually do some PC board layout for a friend of mine who teaches down at Stanford. So an awful lot of his lab projects, I actually lay out the PC boards for them as well.
Oh, that's pretty cool. And you say that you'd like to work with surface mount. How small? I've got a buck converter that's 2 millimeters on a side. I can barely see it. How does that work for you? I've
done some of these 64-pin flat packs, DDS chips. But when you work with those things, you know, obviously you need boards that are made for them. And you use solder paste and hot air system to assemble those boards. But I'm pretty comfortable with that as well.
The listeners know I'm selfishly now asking questions for my own edification. I have this little part that's 2 millimeters on a side. It has no legs. It has little pads underneath that you can't see. Now I could use solder paste. I bought myself a television camera that plugs into my computer that I can get down in there so I can actually see what's happening. My concern is using a hot air tool, which I have, to melt the solder paste to bind to the board, because I'm afraid it's going to blow the part away. Do you have any suggestions on how that works or how to do that?
You need a hold down tool. And in my case, I'm also kind of a garage machinist. I've got a small lathe and a small little, actually it's a Harbor Freight milling machine. And so really what you need is something like the tip of a nail that's on an arm that has a little weight that will hold that part down onto the laminate. And then the hot air works fine. If you don't have a hold down tool, you're right, you'll blow that part to a point you'll never find it. But you can make a hold down tool pretty easily.
Now, do you find that the solder paste will kind of like wick right to the pads? Because in this particular case, I can't see underneath the part. That's where the joints are going to be made. So does that solder paste just happen to wick nicely, onto the pads when you're using the hot air tool and holding it down with the nail head?
You'll be surprised at how well it works. The solder paste, as you heat it, it actually forms little tiny balls. And it kind of rolls around down there looking for something to adhere to. So with a properly prepared board, and of course the component itself is already configured properly so that it acts as a great place for the solder to stick to, those two just match right up. And what's interesting about working with surface mount and hot air, once those little balls of solder align with the pins on the IC and the landing on the substrate or on the printed circuit board, you can actually remove the hold down tool and you'll see the part actually position itself due to the surface tension. It lines itself up. It's pretty amazing.
Now, I thought to get a hot plate and actually, put the circuit board with my solder paste and my parts positioned and then put it on a precision hot plate. Have you ever done something like that?
Many people do. They use toaster ovens and that kind of thing, but I have a hard time visualizing how you take all these little pieces, put the paste on the board, use your tweezers, put the little pieces in place, and somehow manage to get it into the oven and close the tray without those parts moving. So I know a number of people use toaster ovens in the surface mount area. I have never tried it. I just do it individually with a hot air gun and the hold down tool.
Okay, so you have your hot air tool, and it comes with a bunch of different nozzle sizes. What nozzle sizes do you choose nozzle size by the size of the part, or how much air you want to push in a particular direction?
I don't think the part size is too crucial. I think it has everything to do with being able to focus that hot air where you want it. When I first set mine up, I put it together with one nozzle. I've never changed it. But you get into the larger flat packs, it may make sense to change it. At some point, I'm sure I'll have a need to try it.
Now, did the spectrum analyzers, you said you built 2 spectrum analyzers. Did you design the spectrum analyzers that you built, or did you build somebody's?
I built somebody's. The first one was one that Wes Hayward designed, W7ZOI, and it topped out at 60 megahertz. It was a most interesting project. And that was all pretty much dead bug construction, if that means anything to you. You put each piece of circuitry in its own separate little die-cast enclosure. And in my case, I connected them with BNC cables. And it used a voltage tune oscillator. And you built a little ramp generator that performed the sweep function. And the display was CRT oscilloscope. In my case, it was a Tektronix 465B. And it works dramatically well. But I wanted larger bandwidth, and I wanted I wanted something that could give me a little cleaner display so I wouldn't have to constantly be adjusting the scope. There's another design out in the marketplace. It's been around for a number of years. It's called Scotty's Spectrum Analyzer. And in that case, there's some board designs out there. You can buy the boards. It uses a number of phase lock loops with a master oscillator. It's a dual conversion design. The first IF is a 4-stage cavity resonator. I think it's at 10, 12 megahertz. So, you have to machine the cavity resonator, build the boards, and put it all together. It's a pretty involved project. And as I recall, when I first put that together, I ended up spending about $600 between pieces and parts and enclosures and that kind of thing. Works extremely well.
My sense is it's been a number of years since you built that one. The prices of spectrum analyzers has come down. Yeah, I think Wes Hayward's spectrum analyzer is maybe a 20, 30-year-old design. Do you think that there's a room in the market now, or do you think that somebody needs to come up with a spectrum analyzer for 2018 and perhaps maybe a software-defined radio or these modules is that spectrum analyzer? What do you think about that?
Well, SDR certainly fill that bill, but there's a number of really excellent spectrum analyzers in the marketplace that are pretty affordable. Wriggle. I bought a Wriggle about 5 years ago. I think it's a TS815TG. Goes up to 1,500 megahertz. Got a built-in tracking generator and resolution bandwidth filters all the way down. I think it goes down to 50 or 100 hertz. Pretty impressive. And it literally is an SDR. When you fire it up, the hard drive in it boots up. It's kind of interesting. And then there's a company called Siglent, Siglent, that also came out with an SDR design spectrum analyzer. Pretty much the same resolution bandwidth filters, but it actually is. The Siglent has about a 20 dB better dynamic range, which is a significant improvement over the Wriggle model. And if I were to do it today, that's the one that I would buy. This stuff is pretty impressive.
And now this message from QRP Labs. Well, Hans, G0UPL has done it again. QRP Labs announces a new 10-watt linear HF power amplifier kit for just $26 US. That's right, $26 United States currency. This power amplifier comfortably produces 10 watts from a 12-volt DC supply for every mode, including the high-duty cycle digital modes. This new linear amplifier provides 26 dB of gain from 2 to 30 megahertz with a plus or minus 1 dB gain flatness over the entire range. This 10-watt HF linear power amplifier kit has no surface mount components to solder. There are a small number of transformers that need to be wound, and assembly requires care and patience. If you're a beginner, you can still do this kit. The push-pull driver stage uses 2 BS170 transistors in the amplifier found in the soft-walk transmitter design. This final uses 2 IRF510 transistors in push-pull configuration. Yes, this humble low-cost MOSFET is really capable of excellent performance all the way up to 10-meter band and beyond. Hans says the short lead lengths and PCB layout are extremely important to the success of this kit. This kit includes a huge heatsink to prevent overheating even during a 100% duty cycle. Hans sent me a message that he tested key down for 1 hour at 10 watts full power with no forced air cooling. He tested again for 15 minutes at 20 watts, 100% continuous duty cycle with no forced air cooling. He even tested this new power amplifier with a 20-volt DC power supply into an open load, a shorted load, and various mismatches without instability, oscillation, or failure. So if you have a QCX or any other QRP transmitter and want to boost its output power with a highly reliable linear power amplifier at an amazing price, then click on the link in this week's show notes page to tell Hans that you heard it here on QSO Today. QRP Labs is my favorite kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO. What do you think is the most interesting piece of test equipment that you have on your workbench?
Hands down, it is my DG8 SAQ vector network analyzer.
And what do you do with it?
Just about everything. I started off using it for antennas, and then as I mentioned, I was building some super heterodyne radios, and I needed some IF filters. So I bought a big box of some 9 megahertz range crystals. And that little particular device has the capability of running however many crystals you want through it. It generates a spreadsheet with all the motional parameters. So the L constant, the C constant, and the Q of the crystals. And by using that data, you can sort the spreadsheet to build your own crystal filters. You can build some incredibly effective crystal filters when you've got the motional parameters nailed down. And then beyond that, you can use these things for tuning diplexers, filters, almost limitless.
Now, are you the go-to Elmer in your ham radio club when it comes to helping somebody with problems with their equipment or projects that they want to build or checking out some new piece of ham radio equipment?
Our group, the River City Amateur Radio Communication Society, we started a program about 2 years ago where any new member to the club, we automatically assign an Elmer. So all of the members that sit on the board are volunteer Elmers. And if the person who's assigned to this new ham doesn't have the answer, then he gets together with the rest of us and we find a way to help that ham through his program. So I get involved with a number of them. I don't know that I'd say that I'm the leading Elmer, but I would say that I am fairly involved with a number of those situations.
How successful is this program to retaining ham radio operators and growing them into active operators?
I don't have any statistics to that point, but I can tell you that since we started doing this, we no longer experience that phenomenon where somebody comes into a club meeting, sits through the 2 or 3 hours that the meeting is, and you never see their face again. Since we started doing this, they all come back, which I think is the real testimonial. It means that they've found something that appeals to them, and that's what we wish to nurture.
Well, I went to the River City Amateur Radio Communications Society website, and what I was impressed with was there's a whole bunch of people that still need to pay their dues, and it's up. It looks like it's at the top of the web page, and it's a lot of people, which means that there's a lot of people there who probably paid their dues already, which means this is a pretty large club. Would you say it has more than 100 members?
We have 125 members. I think what you were looking at is actually a listing of those who have paid their dues. We don't list members who've not paid. And the reason we did that is most of our members pay their dues via PayPal. But having said that, you don't get an invoice at the end of each year reminding you it's time to pay your dues. So we list those members who have paid on the site. So if they ever have a question in their mind as to whether they have or haven't, the answer's readily available.
What do you think the biggest challenge is to amateur radio today?
There's two things that come to mind. The first one is this issue we touched upon earlier, the role of the HOA and how that impacts the ham radio operator. And it's very troublesome and presents quite a challenge for an awful lot of our members. The other one is, and this is kind of one of my concerns, the FCC no longer is an enforcement agency for the amateur radio portion of the radio frequency spectrum. They expect the ham radio community to be self-policing. And to some degree, that can be accomplished with a little bit of peer pressure or a kind word here or there. But if you listen on the bands, you'll find that there are some people who are just outright profane and rude, and for lack of a better term, obnoxious. The kinds of behavior we used to see back in the 50s and 60s with the CB radio when that craze was happening. And I think it's that kind of behavior that also is going to have a negative impact on our organization. And I'd certainly like to see some effort on the part of the FCC to invoke some true enforcement.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
When the kids were little, and I'd go into the shack to spend a little time working radio, I'd every now and then catch a little hell from my wife about not spending some time with the kids, and she was absolutely right about that. Your children are the most important thing. So I did sacrifice some amateur radio time for some quality family time. And I still think that's the right thing to do. But aside from that, I think that the kids picked up on the fact that technology can be incredibly interesting and engaging, and there's always something to be learned from it. And I think those are good things for members of the family.
Did any of them follow you into ham radio?
No.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Well, this is a much different hobby than it was when I was a kid. The ARRL has wisely, at least in my opinion, endorsed this idea of code-free licensing. And they've been very aggressive in getting, in growing the size of the hobby. I mean, at this point, we're over 750,000 licensed amateurs in the country, I believe. And these digital modes have found an awful lot of acceptance by the ham community. And I think the fact that the hobby is evolving, that there's been this outreach to get more people involved. And you'll also find that people in the emergency care business, hospitals, that kind of thing, they're actually sending some of their staff to get licensed because they recognize that amateur radio can play an important role in getting information to and from emergency scenes. So, it's a hobby that's on the move. The technology's evolving. It moves quick. And the young minds of today like that stuff. So I think those are all positive things.
Well, there's an awful lot of emergency organizations that have licensed their employees, to become amateur radio operators. But it appears, at least from what I'm reading, that the majority of those licensees are not at all active. Does your club try to kind of swoop in and try to change that paradigm, at least in your area?
If we have a mission statement, the one thing that comes out in our board meetings is we try and pick topics for our meetings that hold appeal for the membership. And we try and balance that out between the operational side, the technical side, the social side. And as such, it tends to keep people active in the hobby. As to going out into the community, finding those who are licensed and somehow trying to find something that appeals to them to engage them more in the hobby, we have not done that. And I don't know that will ever be in our mission statement.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Well, there's a number of people who come into our club who were licensed 2 and 3 and 4 decades ago, who've just retired, and they're getting back into the hobby. And my advice to the clubs who recruit these members is consider this Elmer program thing that we've done, and to kind of help the guys get re-entered into the game. And I think spending some time introducing them to these new digital modes would prove to be quite helpful.
Well, I think that's fine advice. Phil, I want to thank you very much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It's been a pleasure, and it was nice to meet you in person at the Pacificon show, and I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to talk to you again on QSO Today. So with that, I want to wish you 73.
Well, Eric, it's been my pleasure as well. Thank you ever so much, and good luck with your program.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Phil. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KD6RM in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Beep, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.